Hello there, and welcome to another of Andre's artist profiles. Now, today I'm going to be profiling an artist who, had she been alive, she would have been 50 years old this year. And that, of course, is none other than Whitney Houston. Now, Whitney Houston sadly passed away last year on February 11th at the age of 48. Now, Whitney Houston had started to develop a very severe drug problem during the mid and late 1990s, during her tumultuous marriage to New Edition member Bobby Brown. Now, I had always personally hoped that she would have come over those issues, but sadly, she died while actually trying to do that in a very tragic manner. But today, I want to celebrate her life on the year that, had she lived, she would have reached the half-century mark, a huge milestone. And one can only wonder what she would have been recording and how successful her career at this point might have been, had she still been alive. Now, I'm going to go into her solo career in a moment here, but I wanted to start off this record, to use a record collector cliche that I've actually recently heard about, a bit of a grail record that's kind of hard to find, but that launched Whitney Houston's career, and that's this. Material, One Down. Material is an avant jazz funk group, of course, headed by bass player Bill Laswell. And this album features people like Bernard Fowler and Nile Rodgers of Chic fame. But what happened was Whitney Houston is featured in her vocal debut on this album, Memories. And now that I think about it, Whitney Houston is actually featured on another album that I own, Chaka Khan's 1980 record, Naughty. I believe she's one of the many backing vocalists on the song Papillon, aka Hot Butterfly, featuring Luther Vandross. She did a lot of voiceover work in the early 80s before getting signed to Clive Davis's Arista Records and making history with this album. Now, growing up in the 80s, when this came out in 1985, this was the record of the family. Especially my mother. She was always playing this, The Greatest Love of All, and one of my favorites on here, Saving All My Love for You. I actually have some 45s that I can't dig out with picture sleeves from this album. There was actually a yogurt you could get at this time called Whitney. And somehow that got associated with this album, and I mean, it was Whitney, Whitney, Whitney all the time. And my favorite song on this now, looking back at it, is actually not any of the hits. It's the second song called Thinking About You, which is a very breezy and spare kind of, funk rocker, I suppose. One of the more experimental songs on this album, and it features Jermaine Jackson, who's also on here on a song called Take Good Care of My Heart, which was a hit. Another good song. Great debut album. Some songs I like better than others, but really good record, actually. Now, this one, I've really grown to fall in love with this album over the years. Not so much for Didn't We Almost Have It All or any of the big ballads she became associated with, but there are songs on here like Love Will Save the Day, which is an amazing 80s funk number, which features Roy Ayers on vibraphone. Now, who else but people like Whitney Houston, big pop stars in the Michael Jackson and Madonna league, were featuring Roy Ayers on their records. So this record has meaning. The up-tempo tunes on this are absolutely slamming. And Whitney's associated with ballads, but man, when Whitney got into the groove, she got into the groove. She had a terrific voice and ability for interpretation, but we all know that. Now, this album came out in 1990. It wasn't one of her most successful, but I rather like the R&B up-tempo rocker title song, and there's a song on here she was written and she duetted with Stevie Wonder on called We Didn't Know, which has one of the most unusual melodies I've ever heard, even from Stevie Wonder, who's known for unusual melodies. Now, if you have iTunes or Stream, You should check that out from this album. We Didn't Know with Stevie Wonder. Now, this is her 1998 comeback album, My Love Is Your Love. This is more of an album, actually. You know, it's not a collection of singles. It's actually a bit more of an album. There's a bit of a kind of light hip-hop R&B flavor because during Whitney's years of doing soundtracks and actually beginning what turned out to be a fatal drug habit, she actually was kind of overcome in the media by people like, Mary J. Blige. There were newer people. And, Whitney suddenly became a little bit passé, and this was her comeback and her final album of the 90s and the 20th century, actually. Now, this is, I remember there was a gay bar in Bangor called the Spectrum, and this album was being very heavily promoted, at least in my area. Whitney Houston at this time was somewhat of a gay icon. And this album is called Just Whitney. A very good album, a little more up-tempo, sleek and contemporary and funky. There's a bit of that, kind of two-step dance beat that was very popular at the time with Aaliyah and Craig David. I don't know if you remember him, Fill Me In, that sort of thing. It sounds very much of its time, but on the funkier end of it. Unfortunately, Whitney's instrument, her voice, is starting to sort of go on this album, but she still actually brings out a lot of passion, which I appreciate. Now, this album turned out to be her finale. I know she doesn't look particularly well on that album cover, and she wasn't. Unfortunately, you could hear from some of this stuff that she was starting to lose her instrument very severely. But there's a song on here called $1 Million Bill, which is an amazing Gamblin' Hop Philly type of song that might have been associated with somebody like her mother, Sissy. And, when she brings up power on this album vocally, she brings it up. But this would be her last studio recording, unfortunately. If she made a follow-up, we'll have to see it a little bit later. Now, this album was released last year. Now, this features people like CeeLo Green on the soundtrack and Jordan Sparks. And this is a wonderful movie, by the way. I think Whitney's role in this movie is rather autobiographical in an interesting way. But Whitney is featured on the song Celebrate and His Eye on the Sparrow. And it's sad to see her voice almost totally lifeless in a way. But she's at least trying to bring up passion on this album. So there we are with my collection of albums by Whitney Houston. And to her and her family, her daughter, Bobby Christina, I send out the best for you. I know that, like last year at this time, this is going to be a very hard time perhaps for Whitney Houston's family, her mother Sissy, and even Bobby Brown, her, ex-husband. I think that, the first year seems like a bad dream when somebody dies, even when they're a celebrity, but the second year is real. So, believe me, a lot of us are feeling it in a very different way. But, to Whitney's family and to all of her admirers around the world, I want to dedicate this video to another one of those gone too soon individuals. And let that be a lesson for all of you. Don't use drugs just because you're a celebrity and you have issues. There's other ways. You don't want to end up like Whitney. And so happy birthday, departed Whitney Houston. Happy 50, and wherever you are, whenever you are, I don't know how the world works in terms of death, really. I don't think anybody does. I hope Whitney's receiving this. See you next time.